I woke up lazily to another morning of my blanket completely drenched in water. Gianna and her friends had emptied a whole bottle on me once again when I had kept ignoring them early in the morning. I changed my clothes and threw my blanket near the large window in the dorm. I walked downstairs and sat at my usual table. I took small bites of toast and watched as Mrs. Mori, the head of the group home, came up front. She only joined us on days when someone was adopted. I didn't pay much attention, as we all knew that it was very rare for parents to adopt the older kids, and I was 16, so I was long gone from the adoption table. But instead of walking to the kids, she walked towards our long table, and suddenly everyone was quiet in anticipation. I sat with a mouthful of bread, not chewing it, just waiting for her to say the name. Elizabeth. I hitch a breath and hold it. There are two girls among us with the name Elizabeth. I always thought my mom had been too lazy to think of a name when she chose Elizabeth. It was the most common name she could possibly choose. Elizabeth Mary Clooney. I dropped a mouthful of bread from my mouth onto my tray as everyone turned towards me, and I heard a murmur all around the tables. I stood up slowly, and suddenly I was aware of my dirty, unwashed pajamas and the oversized t-shirt that just hung around me like a cloth on a hanger. There were so many emotions fluttering in me that I couldn't utter a word and just followed her to her office. Congratulations, Elizabeth! Mr. Jacob Frederick and Mrs. Molly Frederick had put in a special request to adopt you. We'll be sending you there for a week of customary stay, and if all goes well, we will be finalizing everything by next week. This is great for you. Perhaps this is what was written for you. 13 years of endless homes and a final home at 16. You're very lucky indeed. You would have been alone out there at 18 in 2 years. I simply nodded and gave her a tight-lipped smile. I had lived like this for 13 years, from one house to the next. I met so many foster parents, and when I was younger, I would do my best to impress them. But somehow, I always fell short. Nobody had ever wanted to adopt me. My temporary presence seemed enough for them, no matter how much we had bonded. Mrs. Mori was right. I was lucky. Unlike most girls, I had no plans of what I'd do if I get out here. I had come here as a toddler. I didn't know any other world than the one I was introduced to. My mother had left me at a neighbor's house, and when she hadn't returned for 2 days, the neighbor had called the police. The police had taken me into custody and dropped me off at the Child Protection Services. When they couldn't locate my mother for 2 weeks, they had finally given up, and this had become my permanent home. Millie! That's what my mother's name was too. That's all I really remembered about her. They say it had been very hard for them in the beginning. I didn't want to be taken care of by a stranger, and they had to hold me down to feed me or bathe me. I left Mrs. Mori's office and went back to the dorm. As soon as I entered, the girls began whispering and staring at me. I walked over to my bed and saw my bag open with just an old torn t-shirt and a skirt I had from my childhood. Where is my stuff? You don't need anything anymore. Won't your adoptive parents give you new clothes? Are you serious? What? I just decided that we would all need it more. She held out one of the t-shirts that she knew was from my birth mother. The caretakers used to use some of my mother's clothes to soothe me, and one of them had given this to me for keepsake. Gianna, is it so hard for you to be decent? She laughed. Are you going to teach us manners now? You don't need this. You have a brand new mother. I jumped over my bed and snatched the t-shirt from her. I'm just glad I will never see you again. I stared at my closest friend, Kennedy, who sat quietly on her bed without meeting my gaze. She knew she would have to deal with Gianna after I was gone. She didn't want to cross her and make her life difficult. I also knew that everyone around hated me at this moment. They hated the girl who had gotten chosen instead of them. Suddenly I realized I'll be going to live with 2 people I've never met and leaving the life of familiarity here. I sat outside the building in a corner of the garden with a book until nightfall. I went to the dorm when most of the girls were asleep. The ones awake whispered congratulations as I walked to my bed, tiptoeing. I saw Kennedy's book on my bed. She left a note with it, wishing me the best and a small heart. I looked over to her bed. The light was on, and I think I saw her give me a smile before she switched off the light. The next morning, everything seemed rushed. As soon as I had breakfast, I was in Mrs. Morey's office. There were documents to be signed and photographs to be taken. I sat uncomfortably between the two strangers, my new parents, as Mrs. Morey snapped pictures. She gave me a small packet in the end and asked me to change. It was a blue dress with small white polka dots. It was one of the few clothes that actually fit me and the first that seemed new. I felt the ice burning my back as I walked to my dorm in my new dress to pick up the small bag of things I had planned to take with me. I saw Kennedy holding the book I had left on her bed this morning. She smiled and I felt the tears welling up in my eyes. I blinked them away, gave her a smile, and rushed out of the dorm, avoiding everyone else. The car ride from the group home was long and awkward. I stared at the round face of my new mother, Millie. Her long nose and plump lips. We could actually pass like a mother-daughter if no one knew better. For a second, I began imagining she was my birth mother, but I shrugged it off. Her name is just throwing me off, I thought. It's just a coincidence. When we reached the house, they showed me the house and then my room, which was the size of half of my dorm. The cupboard was full of clothes. They all seemed new as well. I suddenly felt overwhelmed and out of place. I took out the old worn-out t-shirt from my bag and wore it. I sat on my bed and looked at the elaborate bookcase above a study table. The books weren't the old torn books we had at the group home. They were all new, with their covers intact and none of the pages missing. "Where did you get that t-shirt?" I got startled as I had been so lost in thought. I hadn't even noticed her. I've had this for as long as I remember. They say it's my mother's. My birth mother's. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. It's fine. She sat next to me on the bed. Do you remember her? Well, not much, but her name was Millie too. She seemed taken aback. Yes, it was. Do you remember me, Betty? What? You were a baby. I didn't think you would remember me, but you remember my name. She clasped my hands in hers. I shrugged them off and stood up. I don't understand. Are you the same Millie? Yes, I looked for you everywhere. When we finally found you, we decided to adopt you. Confessing to the authorities that you are my daughter would be so difficult, so I changed my documents and took my husband's name. I kept staring as she went on. I'm sorry, honey. I know you must be so angry. I just left you, but I have held so much guilt since that moment. I'm sorry. Why? I was just 20. Your father had stopped paying his child support, and with all the loan, we were about to lose the house. When I asked him to keep paying, he threatened to kill us if I informed the authorities. I was afraid. He showed up at the house that day. He pushed me towards the glass cupboards and was about to take you with him. I had to scream and plead with him to let us go. I didn't want him to harm you two. I didn't have any money, not even enough to buy you milk. I decided I'd leave you outside an orphanage, but as soon as I dropped you outside, you began crying. When I started to leave, so I couldn't. I left you with our neighbor. I knew she was kind enough to take care of you and then she would drop you to some group home or a foster home. I thought you'd at least be fed. I'm sorry, I should have found a job, done anything, but not left you there. She was sniffling and her eyes were red as she continued. I had lost all hope of ever finding you, but I wanted to give it a try. Thankfully, you hadn't been adopted and they hadn't changed your name. She knelt on the floor. I'm so sorry. We heard a shuffle outside and knew that Jacob was coming upstairs. Millie wiped off her tears and stood up. Give me a chance, Betty. It's Elizabeth. I was angry, more angry than I'd ever been on Gianna. She had abandoned me and then adopted me, assuming that I'd accept her back in my life. For the next few days, I never spoke to my mother directly. She didn't force me either, but her actions eventually warmed me up. My bed was always made, the food was always warm, my clothes were always washed and ironed. It felt like she genuinely wanted to make up for everything. The week was finally over, and when we went to finalize the adoption at the court, they asked me. I looked at her for a while before I answered. Her breath was snitched and she stared at me solemnly, her hands folded in a prayer under the table. I cleared my throat on the mic and said, yes. She deserved a second chance. I thought back to the days in the dorm of the group home. I deserved one too, one with respect, kindness, and a family.